I would like to talk to you about this work, but first of all, I'd like to say a few words about its composer and the world that he came from and the background of the society that first greeted it. I think it's 174 years ago. And I also want to tell you about this work, and parts of it have entered into, what do we call it now, popular culture, and they have been there for many years. But I want to tell you about my own personal favorite reference to Rigoletto from the movies, from Hollywood. And that is in a film called Some Like It Hot. And I imagine some of you remember that film. Well, that film had bad guys in it, if you remember, and one of them was George Raft, or played by George Raft. And the cops were grilling him about where he was on the night of the murder. And he said, "I was at Rigoletto." And the cop said, "Well, where's that?" He said, "It's an opera, you ignoramus." And then later on, they're asking his cohorts, "Where were you?" "We was at Rigoletto's." So that's my favorite thing ever. I think it's also Joey Pietroia's. So going on from that auspicious starting point, Verdi is, of course, one of the twin pillars of opera from the 19th century, the 1800s, the other one being Richard Wagner. There are many, many others, of course, but those two seem to really hold up the building, and they were both born in 1813. A little bit about the world that Verdi was born into. First of all, it's important to remember that Italy was not a unified country by any means, and so Verdi was born into a period that was very fraught with political difficulty and the threat constantly of being repressed by a foreign power. So it has a relevance that I don't think even Brenna foresaw when it was programmed. And in fact, Verdi was born into revolution, essentially. He was born in Parma, in a little tiny hamlet called La Roncole, so I guess we can say he was Parmesan. And he was not born into anything like a wealthy or cultured family, in the sense that although they enjoyed music, their primary outlet for it would have been church. And in fact, that's where Verdi had his first exposure to music, and also his first exposure to the performance of music, because as a tiny child, well, 9, he was playing the organ at church already. And very lucky for him, and even perhaps luckier for us, his father noted that this boy was especially talented. So although his father was not rich, he wasn't broke either, he purchased a little spinet keyboard instrument for Verdi to practice on, and helped him learn as much as he can from any of the musical inhabitants of the village. And he encouraged Verdi's ambitions to pursue music ultimately professionally. So nearby is a town called Busseto, and living in Busseto is a merchant who wanted to help this talented young composer study and learn. So Verdi did have a professor, and he did learn theory. He learned what he needed to know about music and background. And at one point, it must have been very clear that if he wished to do so, he just simply could have become a perfectly respectable church musician in a small Italian community. But by the time we get to the 1820s, shall we say, there's really two directions in Italy. We don't really consider or really recall that in the 18th century, there was a large amount of internationally renowned instrumental music composed and published by Italian composers, Vivaldi, Corelli, Scarlatti. But we don't think of Italy in the Romantic era as really producing symphonies, do we? We think of them as producing operas and sacred music. And Verdi obviously had his eye on what Handel had already noted, and any number of other composers, that if you want to seek fame and fortune in music, the opera house is where you do it. Kind of like the movies. Of course, you may have a spectacular flop and be out of the public's eye by Friday after a success on Monday, but if you really want to score, then the opera house is the way to go. And Verdi had his ambitions, I think, centered on that. Now, I don't want to make it sound mundane or just materialistic. He just had an instinct. He had a genius for portraying character and drama through music. Unparalleled. But there was also a very business-like side to Verdi's personality. He was going to make sure he succeeded. And a little bit more about that later, perhaps, as well. So in the course of his learning, he fell in love with the daughter of his patron, shall we say. Margherita was her name. And his patron had so much faith in Verdi's strength of character and his talent that even though he had gotten nowhere yet, he gave his permission for the two to marry. And Verdi went ahead and married her, and they had 2 children, a boy and a girl. And then he went to Milan and applied for the conservatory. Another of my very favorite stories about Verdi. He was rejected by the conservatory. Partly they felt he was a bit old to be entering, and also there were certain rudimentary skills that he did not yet possess. So I think this was actually lucky for Verdi, but just to finish my little favorite story, he kept a list in his desk for the rest of his life of all those people who were accepted that year to the Milan Conservatory. And I like to think he was nothing if not vindictive. He had a real capacity to hold a grudge. I like to think of him very, very gleefully crossing each of the names out as they died, because he lived a very long time. And also noting that they died in obscurity, and that wasn't going to happen to Joe Green, as people like to call him, Giuseppe Verdi. So this, I think, was the best thing that could have happened to him, because he went to Piccola Scala, and he began to work at La Scala, Milan. Now, how many of you had heard really of the Conservatory of Milan before I mentioned it? How many of you have heard of La Scala? Yes, there you go. So that was a place for Giuseppe, and he began to learn. And one of the things we must acknowledge about Verdi is that he learned the business of opera from the bottom up. He knew how to coach singers. He knew how to recognize qualities in voices that would be perfect for this or that or the other role. He had inherited a world of bel canto from Rossini, Donizetti, and Bellini, and he understood the way to create an opera in the Italian style. What he will do is transcend it. He will never abandon what he felt were the essential qualities of Italian art. More about that a bit later as well. He will never abandon that, but his operas move far beyond the structural limitations that were imposed on those by, well, Donizetti and Bellini, but even to a certain point, Rossini. So he's going to take Italian opera to almost the extent of where it could go. But he learned his craft first. He was, above all, an impeccable craftsman and a perfectionist. And because of these two things, probably not always all that easy to work with. So he began his career with an opera called Oberto. Has anyone ever heard of that? No, it hardly ever gets produced. And it was such, by our standards, we would call it a moderate success, but it was noticed, so he was given a contract. And he became allied with a publishing house called Ricordi. This is really important because they are going to help him for the rest of his career. And then he produced a comedy, and it was called Queen for a Day, and it was a failure. I'll just toss this in because we aren't talking about this one, but he doesn't write a comedy again until his very last opera, when he writes Falstaff, which is considered the greatest Italian comedy not by Mozart in opera. So he then suffers some debilitating, devastating setbacks. First of all, within the course of about 18 months, his daughter, his son, and his wife all die of illnesses. Now, this is something that happened tragically frequently in the 19th century, everywhere. After all, everyone hears that Bach had 23 children, but we don't always remember that only about half of them survived. So in any case, Verdi has this awful calamity visited upon him, and of secondary importance, but still professionally important, is that his comedy has tanked. He loses faith in himself as an artist completely. And it was Ricordi, it was the publishing house of Ricordi that kept after him to kind of incite enthusiasm inside him again. It was really difficult because he was profoundly depressed. And somebody gave him, they kept offering him texts, libretti as we call them, and somebody finally gave him one, and as he says, it fell open on his desk. Has anyone ever had a book actually fall open on your desk? It sounds like it happens anyway. And it fell open to a verse in a biblical story of Nebuchadnezzar that's sung by the exiled Jews on the banks of a river when they don't think they'll ever see their home again. And it resonated with him because he was part of a culture that was oppressed by foreigners and not really allowed to be themselves. And the verse goes, Va pensiero sull'ali dorati, go thoughts on wings of gold back to my homeland. Why is the harp hanging silently from the trees? Oh, my country, so beloved and so lost. And this fired him up. And he wrote that chorus immediately and then proceeded to write of the rest of his third opera, which we know today as Nabucco. Pacific Opera produced it in 2001. It has a massive chorus. It was hard work, but it was a success. Anyway, Nabucco got him back on the map. It got him back into life. It also introduced him to a soprano of really colossal dramatic ability. And she was a drama queen anyway, so her voice didn't last all that long, but her name was Giuseppina Strepponi, and they became an item. And they lived together both in Milan and in other cities where they worked. They lived together in rural Italy, back near Verdi's homeland, without benefit of marriage, in conservative Catholic rural Italy. Go Joe, I say. They did ultimately get married. And there's funny stories about that, but I better get hurtling towards ours. So Verdi had to write to satisfy his employers. And he referred to these as his galley years. He was doing well. He was beginning to see some international interest in his work. But when you look at it, the first 20 years of Verdi's career, it would be about 20 years, were not productive of the great masterpieces. He was still honing his craft, but he was also working under a system that didn't really give artists a lot of time to cogitate and ruminate about what they really wanted to do. They didn't give him a lot of freedom to choose his colleagues, to choose his singers, to choose the houses his works would be presented in. And gradually, he began working, as he got better known and better financially set, to create this kind of artistic freedom for himself. So the galley years were not easy for Giuseppe Verdi, but they were productive. Now we get to the early 1850s. This is when Verdi was approaching the age of 40. So Mozart had already died by the time he turned 40. It was also a time when Wagner, his contemporary, was living in exile in Switzerland, and he had produced a few operas already himself, but The Ring was in the future, Tristan was in the future. And here's Verdi getting a commission from La Fenice, a house in Venice. Now, he had gone to see a play. This in itself is a little bit unusual, and also quite revolutionary. It reminds me of an opera we did not that long ago called The Marriage of Figaro, which was also an act of revolution. He decided to set, he wanted to set, he became inflamed with a desire to set a French play, a contemporary French play by Victor Hugo called Le Roi s'amuse, The King Amuses Himself. This had been taken off the stage immediately in France because it was an indictment of the ruling class and the behavior of the ruling class. And as a matter of fact, there's a quote in it which I will read to you. And by an indictment, I mean it portrayed the ruling class as being absolutely morally bankrupt. And of course, a lot of it had to do with sex. So the character who will become our title character, Rigoletto, has had his daughter seduced by the King of France. And he turns to all the assembled nobles and said, "Amidst the hunting grounds, your mothers hoard themselves to their lackeys. You are all bastards." So perhaps it's unsurprising that this was yanked off the stage immediately. But Verdi saw in this character of a hunchbacked jester to the king somebody who he said is equal to any of the dramatic characters in history, including those of Shakespeare. He is equal to the greatest accomplishments of Shakespeare. So he and his librettist, his most frequent collaborator in this regard, Francesco Maria Piave, they set about to create an opera of this work, and the first and greatest hurdle they had to overcome, since Verdi had no shortage of inspired ideas about it, the first hurdle they had to overcome was to get it past the censors, who were, of course, Austrian. Are there any Austrians in the room? Even if there were, I'd remind you that they can be pretty prim and proper about such things as sex. Well, I guess so can almost everybody. But in any case, they were also repressive. They weren't about to let some Italian composer and librettist tell them what to do. So they rejected it outright. One of the first reasons was that there was an absolute scandal of moral depravity. At that point, Hollywood directors who hadn't even been born yet were sort of pricking up their ears. Yeah, I want my hands on that. But also because the central character was a hunchback. And that is what it says in the text. There's no way we can clean that up. That's what he is. He has a physical deformity that is noticeable and that makes him slightly repulsive to the people around him. And Verdi was quite annoyed by the fact that they suggested that such a character could not be successfully presented in a musical dramatic work. Who were they to know, he said. I, Verdi, even I don't know, but at least I can try. So in any case, they did what has been done many times before. Verdi sort of ordered Piave to, I think he said, grow 4 feet and find somebody in Venice who knows these censors and who will testify on our behalf. But they also presented a version of the story that had absolutely insurmountably, almost obscene things going on in them to distract the censors from the actual subtle nuances that they wanted to have in there. Censors, fortunately, in either Queen Victoria's England or Austria, or the Austrian Habsburg Empire's Venice, were stupid. They were thick. And so that strategy worked. And on March 11th, 1851, Rigoletto was presented at the Opera House La Fenice in Venice. And it was, as Verdi knew it would be, a stupendous success. And he would go on to produce another pair of works in what is really a triple whammy. He produced another operatic setting of a French contemporary play by Alexandre Dumas' fils called, well, it's called The Lady of the Camellias, but we know it as La Traviata. That ran into a lot of trouble too. It's one thing to do it in Paris, where everybody's morals are a little loose, but in Catholic Italy, you have basically a prostitute, and you were supposed to feel sorry for her? Yes, actually, and it works every time. How many of you have seen La Traviata? How many of you were dry-eyed at the end of it? Very few people. And also, another good barnbuster of a tuneful opera, Il Trovatore. Now, what this gave Verdi, I'll just get him out of the picture, we'll sort of tell you what happened to him afterwards. What this gave him was independence. It gave him a very great amount of financial security. He even had a house built, he had a farm built for himself. And this is another funny story. He was kind of a DIY guy. You can see him, he would probably love hardware stores. And Giuseppina Strepponi told of this dinner party that she was having with her partner, and he hadn't finished the ceiling in the dining room yet because he was doing some project, and so little birds were flying in and out of it, and she just had to shrug. And I thought, I bet that's happened to a lot of people, that renovations take longer than you think they're going to. Anyway, so now a little bit more about the opera, but the freedom that Verdi granted was granted because of this gave us works like Un ballo in maschera. It gave us works like Don Carlos, and it gave us works like Aida, and his revised version of Simon Boccanegra, and ultimately the two great Shakespearean works, Othello and Falstaff. And he was able to go to the houses that wanted to perform even revivals of his older works and basically let them know if they didn't have the technological means to actually produce the works as he wanted. He was able to make specific demands of his publishers and employers as to what stories he would choose to set. And finally, he was no longer in the galleys. He was in his rightful position of leadership. And so Rigoletto very quickly became one of the leading operas of Italy. It was produced everywhere. And I want to give you a little bit of a reason as to why, as to what you're going to see. Now, this is not like when we produced Macbeth. Not everybody knows that Shakespearean opera. It's not like when we produced Nabucco, which actually doesn't get done as often as the real potboilers. How many of you have seen Rigoletto live in a performance? Okay, so a few of you have. So you will already know some of this material. So I hope I don't bore you by repeating myself. But we will begin now with a little bit about this story and the characters we're going to meet. And we learn a lot about it in the first few minutes. So it's really important that you pay attention to the surtitles. And this is a device that Verdi also uses in La Traviata. We begin at a party. We begin with a prelude in the orchestra. This is a very short prelude, but boy, do we ever know this is going to be fraught with drama, this story. So it has very dramatic, blaring trumpets and trombones. ultimately, and finally ending with a ferocious minor chord. So that means that this is going to be a serious work, right? Now, at the beginning, it couldn't be more frivolous. It couldn't be more light. And now I have to explain a tradition that occurs not only in this opera, but also in La Traviata. I said we begin with a party. That means people are cavorting, they're dancing, they're drinking, they're flirting with each other. So there's a lot of activity, and it's captured in the music. And what Verdi would really like, and we are all going to have to tell you that another thing Verdi had in Venice that we don't have in Victoria is they don't have unions, and we do. And so we can't afford to do what Verdi wanted, which is to have a banda behind the scenes of the stage. So the orchestra in the pit wouldn't have been playing after the prelude. What you would have heard is a small team of instruments that's behind the scene, and they are the orchestra, the little band that would have been hired by the Duke at his party to entertain the guests when they're dancing, when they're eating. And that does create quite an effect for opera houses that have the space and the money. It's also used, by the way, in Handel's Julius Caesar, in Mozart's Don Giovanni. It's a tradition we don't really see much anymore. But you might remember, going back to around 2009 or 2008, POV presented a work called Regina. Did anybody see that? Well, that had a little banda, and we used one. We had, because it was only piano and two other instruments. So in any case, you won't hear it, but you will hear that the orchestra is reduced, especially after that thundering little prelude. And they're playing party music. Something like that. And so what we're privy to is these collections of little snatches of conversation. We'll hear the Duke and one of his courtiers, and they're talking at first about a girl that the Duke has met at church, and she doesn't know who he is. She seems to live in a little house somewhere, but she's really pretty and she's really attractive, and the Duke has set his eyes on her. But we also learn something else. There's a married couple, Count and Countess Ceprano, at the party, and the Duke has his eye on Countess. And her husband is right there, but the Duke's going to have his way with her. And his courtier says to him, well, her husband's right there. I don't care. And what we learn from that is, actually, the Duke likes to have his way with married women, because it also humiliates their husbands and it reminds them that he's the head honcho, he's the king kahuna, he rules. And no matter how privileged they may think they are in their position in court, it depends on him and his favor. Another thing that resonates somewhat more loudly today than perhaps it did a year ago. Anyway, so we learn this about the Duke, and then we learn that he doesn't care. He likes to have his way with women, and then he discards them. And he sings a little sort of canzonetta, a little song. It can't really be said to be an aria, but it gives us an idea of his character, both through what he says, which is women are just like disposable pieces of temporary pleasure for me, but also the actual music. I'll explain that to you as I play a little bit of it. This is the accompaniment. So there's not a lot going on in terms of harmony or counterpoint. Nothing that brings us underneath the surface of the character who's singing this melody. So it has high note or two, but it really is just basically, as Verdi says in the music, sung with elegance, that's all. He's suave, he's got a lot of surface charm, he should be young, he should be slim, he should be handsome, he should have some qualities that make it understandable why women find him attractive, not just rich. Sometimes he's those things, sometimes he's none of those things, it depends on who gets cast. But he has to sound very pleased with himself, very happy with the way his life is going, a little bit happy that he has it within his power to destroy anyone he feels like doing so with. But there's nothing underneath, right? It has a surface quality, has a surface attraction, but it's almost free of any dissonance that might suggest turmoil or inner conflict. The phrases are absolutely predictably regular. That's it. And even the accompaniment does nothing other than this. He could be going to the teddy bear's picnic if we turned it into a minor key. That's all there is to him. And that's one of the things that Verdi is ingenious about characterizing, because we will look underneath the surface for other characters, but we get the feeling that underneath the surface is nothing with the Duke. So he's enjoying his power as a seductor. Now, the music goes from being active, vital, and quick to being a characteristic courtier's minuet. And so the dance, as if we follow Verdi's instructions, it'll be danced. There'll be elegant couples dancing the minuet. And that's when the Duke makes his move on the Countess, who, it must be admitted, seems to be more than willing to go along with him. Now, I should have explained earlier than this why it's the Duke, because remember, this was the king amusing himself in Paris. That's one of the things that the Venetian/Viennese critics insisted on, was that it not be a king, it not be a crowned head of state. So it was just a mere Duke. They also said it had to be it had to be set in an earlier century. And Verdi didn't care about those things. His interest was human behavior that is universal and eternal, and also about this central character of the court jester, who we're going to meet soon. So all of this frivolity, all this jollity, is interrupted by the arrival of a man who does have the nerve and the courage and the moral fortitude to stand up to the Duke. The Duke has debauched his own daughter, and he's going to seek revenge. This is Count Monterone. He doesn't have a big part, but it's of huge importance. And I'll play a little bit of his music, because it tells you immediately that this is a man with rage, and a man that has been insulted. He basically comes on and says, "I want to talk to him, it must be." And everybody does shout out, "Oh, Monterone." They know that this is not going to be a pleasant interaction. I should say this too, because I've always felt this music was making fun of Rigoletto. Rigoletto has approached the Count Monterone to speak on behalf of the Duke. And he reproaches him, he caricatures him, he makes fun of him. He says, why are you whining about the way we treat your daughter? You're making fun of us, you've been a rebel, you should be put into prison. But the music is sort of awkward. And then, and when music sounds a little bit awkward, it's meant to illustrate that something on stage is also a little bit awkward. And I think it's the gait of the court jester. He's stumbly, a little bit awkward, a little bit clumsy. And he addresses the Duke, he addresses the Count Monterone abysmally, appallingly. And this is how he always talks to the courtiers. He just makes fun of them. He makes fun of their stupid wives and their ridiculous infatuation with their wives. And why would you care what the Duke does? He just does whatever he wants. Because he knows the Duke will always protect him. He has the Duke's protection. And he knows that he can live with that. He, however, has a secret. But I want to play you some of Monterone's music because it's unmistakably that of a very powerful character. Okay, again, that orchestra is letting us know in no uncertain terms how really mad that character is. And he will be hauled off, but he says two things. He says, I will come back. You can cut my head off, but I'll still come back. And I will haunt you, and I'll come after you throughout all of eternity. And then he levels against both the Duke and the jester a father's curse. Now, curse is a good enough word in English, but in Italian it's maledizione. That's awesome, isn't it? Try it on your friends. And that just means like evil diction, evil word. And that was going to be the title of this piece. At first, Verdi wanted to call it La Maledizione, which would be in English the curse. I'm glad he didn't call it that. So he names it instead after his court jester. And this is something that the Duke is able to just brush off. But Rigoletto isn't. A father's curse, that hits him really, really deeply. And so off he goes, everybody flees, Rigoletto's on his way home, and he meets an interesting character. This is a brother. There's a brother and sister. This is the brother whose name tells us a little bit of what he's like. His name is Sparafucile, that is gunshot. And he's essentially a hired assassin. So we're on the streets of Mantua at dark, these little sort of byways, and he introduces himself to us, and then he sees Rigoletto, and Rigoletto's been thinking about this father's curse, and so Sparafucile comes to Rigoletto and offers his services. And Rigoletto at first thinks he's begging, but he realizes what this guy is offering, and he says, no, I don't think so, but just in case, how much would it cost for a nobleman? And Sparafucile says, that would be a bit more. So they sort of got each other's number at this point. And in one of my favorite lines, I don't know why this was in the text, but obviously Verdi felt it was important because he really worked with his collaborators closely. He said, where are you from? And Sparafucile says, I'm Burgundian. So that must have meant something in 1851, but he's from Burgundy. And then Rigoletto makes it home. And at home, he has a daughter. Nobody at court knows about this. He has a daughter named Gilda. And Gilda has been brought up in a convent, so she's only recently been brought home to her father, who wants her to see nothing of the world because he knows how horrible it is, and he makes a mistake. He makes a mistake that some parents make. You must all, if you have children, know that if your kid really wants to see a certain person, the worst thing you can do is forbid that to happen, because then it will happen. So he doesn't want his daughter to meet anybody. She only goes out to church. Well, guess who she met at church? The Duke has been disguising himself as an impoverished student, and this is the girl he was talking about back at court. She doesn't know who I am, and she's cute. She's a real cutie. I'm going to get my hands on her. We also begin to realize Sparafucile made a slightly baffling comment, and we now understand. He's been watching Rigoletto's house because he sees that there's a pretty blonde girl inside. Assuming that this is his wife or mistress, he also notices that another man comes in and says hello to her from time to time. So he says, I could get rid of rivals. He assumes the Duke is a rival of this hunchback guy. So the plot is thickening, but it's fleeting little references. People who don't read the titles and don't get it will still like the opera, but it's nice to be in the know. Now, there's a couple of things we just have to accept as one of those things that, well, these things happen in plays too. Rigoletto meets Gilda, or goes in to be with his beloved daughter, and she keeps asking him questions like, who was my mother and what's your name? Now, we would ordinarily assume that a girl would know these things. We learn, however, that her mother has been in heaven for a long time and looks out over them, and that above all, Rigoletto wants to protect his daughter from the world. So that's an essential part of her. She's naive, she doesn't know anything, she's vulnerable. And she has a nurse named Giovanna. And Giovanna is one of those ladies of a certain age that we find in Italian operas everywhere that are governesses or maids or, look after people. And they're always vulnerable to bribery because they didn't get paid all that much in those days. So we will learn that the Duke has been bribing this maid to give him access to the girl. She doesn't know necessarily that he's a Duke because he's disguised as an impoverished student, but they have a love scene. And then she sings an aria that tells us a lot about Verdi's perception as to how we portray a character's emotional state through a musical reaction to her words. This is one of the more famous arias from this work. Caro nome means beautiful name. She has finally learned the name of her supposed lover, Gautier Maldet. Now, when she sings this eulogy to his name after she's all alone on stage, this will seem like an aria, but in many ways Verdi is moving beyond the conventions of bel canto to create a solo number that moves seamlessly into the next part of the drama. Of course, audiences will clap. You will clap, I'm sure. But he tries to get the climax of the aria over with and then introduce more characters. So I'll play you a little bit of the tune. Now, one of the no-nos in setting any language to music is that you don't breathe or you don't insert rests between syllables of text. But he does this all over the place in this one. Caro no me che il mio cor primo palpitar. Those are all little rests that are in between syllables, which we're not supposed to do. But how better to suggest the absolute breathless excitement and almost anxiety of a girl experiencing her first love. I'm going to play you the flute part. Or no, it's violins that interrupt her. Heart flutters. So she's by herself in the moonlight, singing about the joyous rapture of being in love with this impoverished student. And she is, because she's pure, she's attracted to the idea of being in love with somebody who's of humble origins and not rich. So there she is, by herself, except that gathered outside is a group of courtiers. They have also noticed that Rigoletto, one of them has noted that this jester that they all hate because he's made fun of them so freely and with the protection of a man that they simply can't fight, they found out that he has a mistress. They assume that because she's a pretty young thing and the Duke looks after his court jester pretty well, so he can afford a mistress. So they are set on abducting her and taking her to the Duke. And so they come in and we hear their rustling, we hear their little snippets of conversation as her aria is finished, as it's finishing. So ideally it leads on into the next sequence. This is a bold move on Verdi's part. It's a really definite departure from the norm, where somebody sings an aria, it ends, everyone claps, and then we go on to the next thing. So these courtiers are outside, and of course Rigoletto comes back, and he recognizes them, but he assumes they're there to kidnap Countess Ceprano. And so they inveigle. This is another one of those things that's opera, it's not real. They coax him and cajole him and fool him into helping them kidnap her. And he says, oh, thank goodness. Yes, I will do that, of course. So they say, but you have to wear a mask. And in doing this, they wrap a mask around his eyes that also is a blindfold, so he can't see. Now, most of us, if we were coming home and someone wrapped blindfold around us, we'd know that we hadn't been transported to another house. We just would know that. They do usually sort of twirl him around a few times so he loses his equilibrium. But he imagines now that he's at another house. And they go inside, they give Giovanna a bribe, and they kidnap this daughter and take her. And they have a wonderful little song they sing. Quiet, 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 zitti, zitti. I'm going to play a little bit of that for you. I remember thinking that aria, that little chorus was in E major. It's in E flat major. And then that means that it will sound like this. Now, doesn't that sound like furtive music? You can sort of see it on Saturday morning cartoons when somebody's sneaking around trying to scare somebody else. And that's exactly what the courtiers do. They manage to wrest Gilda from her home. And finally, she's able off stage to shout for help, and Rigoletto hears her, tears the blindfold off and realized he's been duped. And he says, what does he say at the end of this act? The father's curse. It's coming true. So, back at the ranch, back at the mansion, back at the Duke's place, we hear him sing something that gives a slight sense of pathos. He's, like many a bully, he's feels immensely sorry for himself when he can't have something he wants. And he has found out that this cute girl he was after has been abducted, and he doesn't know where. He doesn't know it was his own courtiers. He's going to find that out to his great delight. But he sings an aria about how pure she was, and it even could have been love, blah, 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 blah. But let's listen to the music. It's pretty. Etc. It's a tune. It's very lovely, but it has, again, a very generic accompaniment, no particularly ingeniously unique treatment of the text. So he does have a feeling or two that can be hurt, but we can't really go much further than that. He's not torn apart by this. He's just rather disappointed. And he will, as I say, exude delight when he realizes that this girl has actually been abducted for him, and he deserves her. And so what will go on behind closed doors, I don't think will take much imagination for you to figure out. But Rigoletto is bereft, and he knows that he's been tricked. He knows who by. So he has to come to the palace the next day and act as if he's very nonchalant. He's not going to give anything away. So we have this wonderful scene where courtiers goad him. They say, "So, how are you, Rig? Enjoying yourself?" And he basically just sings a little la-la tune. And this is sometimes called the la-ra-la aria. It's not an aria in any sense. That is kind of an introduction to what is probably the single greatest aria in this entire piece, and one of the greatest ones that Verdi wrote. If I may say that the Duke is a tenor, what else would he be? Gilda, the daughter, needs to have a soprano that's capable of light, agile singing, but also a certain degree of power. Sparafugile is sort of a bass. What else is a villain like that going to be? Rigoletto is a curious kind of voice type that emerges in the 19th century that we call a Verdi baritone. And it has to have the ability, the voice has to have the ability, the singer has, to sing usually pretty high, to certainly be able to sing above the bass staff, but still with a great deal of power, a great deal of heft. When Rossini brings his baritones up high, they sing almost in head voice, but no, that's not for Verdi. And he was often accused of ruining the baritone voice. The only way you can do that is if you try to manufacture a voice that isn't yours. A voice that's naturally gifted for Verdi baritone roles will emerge usually a bit later in life, but they are there. And now we have ample proof of this, because finally Rigoletto breaks down. He explains to the courtiers, begging them to release his daughter to him, that she's not his mistress, she is his daughter, and to them that's even better. Because remember, they hold him in utter disdain and contempt. So he sings a great aria called Cortigiani, courtiers, the most vile, evil creatures of the world. Tramps, scamps. It reminds us a little bit about what the court jester said in the play. And that, again, has wonderful orchestral music that really gives us the measure of the dramatic situation. Here we go. So that's what the orchestra's doing, and he's singing, really bellowing up here. So it's impossible, it's difficult enough to illustrate orchestral music at the piano. It's impossible really to give you the feeling of vocal music. But he is enraged at first. He degrades them, he insults them, and then he begins to try to plead with them. And what you'll hear here in this section is the tempo slows down and it becomes bel canto music. In this particular piece, though, the accompaniment that I'm going to play you is played on a solo cello. It's always interesting when composers make choices to have instruments from a section, cello, violin, play solo. It creates a whole different sound. All the time singing. So incredibly effective, lyrical, beautiful music in which the baritone has to go through such a wide variety of emotions. The singing actor has to have everything available in his emotional apparatus and his vocal apparatus to really bring this aria to life, which ours will do, of course. And we see now into the humanity of Rigoletto. He's very easy to dislike in the first act, but we begin to understand his behavior, understand where society has put him, and understand why understand that he is deeply, he loves his daughter very, very, very deeply, very genuinely. And maybe he is beginning to realize that his efforts to protect her went far enough that she was not really prepared for what the world had to throw at her. So she is given back to the Duke only after suffering the fate worse than death that some people did consider better than starving. So she's given back to him, her dad, and improbably she's still in love with him. And so her dad figures, okay, I've got to do something about this. So we get into the last act. Now remember Sparafucile and his promise. So what we will learn is that the Duke will bring Gilda dressed as a boy, for reasons that I'll make clear in a minute. And they go to the little hut that is inhabited on the outskirts of town by Sparafucile and his sister Maddalena. Any Italians, any 19th century Italians in the room, any 19th century Italian audience member would know immediately, as soon as they find out that a girl's name is Maddalena, that she's a floozy. She has around the block been. And so is the case. Maddalena is actually an accomplice of her brother. She's she's pretty, she's sexy, and she's available. And she makes that known to the intended victim and says, come to my place. And so they all say yes. And so the Duke is no exception. So he goes to meet Maddalena at her house, and Sparafucile will be there as well. He's even introduced. And the Duke says, I want some wine and your sister. And so he just goes up to rest. And we are going to hear him sing a song. And this song was given to the tenor, it's said, this might be part of operatic myth, but it was given to the tenor only the day before dress rehearsal, because Verdi knew that he had a hit on his hands. And this is described in the score as a canzona. A canzona would be something like a folk song, a song of the street. So it's meant, again, to be something actually rather common. And its accompaniment couldn't be more like an organ grinder. heard that before. So people all around the world know that song without even knowing it's from an opera, let alone Rigoletto. And what is the rhythm? Ya-da-da-da-ba-da, ya-ba-ba-ba-ba-da. It just is completely square, completely and very easily memorable. And what is he saying? La donna immobile means women are fickle. Now remember his little announcement at the first scene. Oh, girls, dime a dozen. I'm going to enjoy every dime I get my hands on. Now he's saying women are fickle. Their emotions blow in the wind. You can't trust any of them. And so, well, we already knew he was like that, but this is him establishing his personality. And Maddalena has fallen for him a little bit. And ultimately, she wants to persuade, well, I'll tell you afterwards what she wants to persuade her assassin brother to do. But imagine this, picture this. You're in a little hut by the side of the town, near a river, and it's night, of course. And you have this assassin brother and sister inside, and upstairs the intended victim is having a little nap before debauchery. And then outside we have Rigoletto with his daughter dressed up as a boy, because a young girl would be very vulnerable traveling in between places in those days. And one of them's napping, the other four are singing. And this is an example of what can happen in opera, but not theater. We hear a different emotional response to the same dramatic situation from each of the four of them. So first we'll hear the Duke singing exactly the words, beautiful daughter of love, I want to marry you, I want you to be mine. The very words that Gilda heard from him. And she's outside listening. And Maddalena, he's good for a romp in the hay, but not much more than that. She says, I've heard all this before, you've said that to everybody. And she laughs. And Gilda is outside and she's weeping because she heard those words himself and they were obviously insincere. And Rigoletto, almost in a declamatory manner, says, Taci, be quiet. We will get our revenge now. So again, a relatively slight accompaniment. That's what we're going to have. We don't need anything much from the orchestra for this because we've got four voices, each of them doing a different thing. The Duke. And boy, will there ever be high notes and lyrical melodies. He's at his most seductive. He's at his most riveting and charismatic and suave. And Maddalena just goes, I've heard talk is cheap. There's no denying that your compliments amuse me, but that's all they are. And then we have Gilda moaning in these beautiful descending lines. Maddalena, Gilda, and now Rigoletto, all on a single pitch. He moves around after that, but he says, be quiet, your tears are useless now. And we will hear all of them at the same time. So there's this wonderful quartet tapestry where we get to eavesdrop on each of the characters' emotions. And okay, now is not the time to ask if it's realistic that four people could be singing at operatic full volume at the same time within feet of each other and they wouldn't hear each other. Yes, of course it's not possible, but you just have to suspend disbelief. Okay, how could there not be a storm brewing at a time like this? So there's a storm with thunder and lightning and an offstage chorus. I should mention that this is only a men's chorus in Rigoletto, and they are going to sing, they're going to make the sound of the wind. Okay, this was before silent movies, so it hadn't become a cliche yet. Mozart did the same thing in Don Giovanni. But we basically have this sepulchral sound that the men will make. So of course there's thunder and lightning. And the men. Sorry, with closed mouth. It's like those instruments called theremines. Would be an ideal way to create the feeling of that storm. And Gilda makes a decision. Rigoletto has said, go, leave, I'll meet you in Verona, I think. But she stays and she overhears what's going to happen. Maddalena begs Sparafucile to spare this man's life because she finds him attractive. And Sparafucile asks one of my favorite lines, do you expect me, do you think I have no honor? So he agrees. What he agrees to do is if anybody comes along before midnight, he'll kill that person instead. And Gilda overhears him. So now you know what's going to happen. I should have had spoiler alert. But what they have arranged to do is Sparafucile will basically drop this sack containing the body into a boat and give it to Rigoletto, who will have the honor of throwing it into the water. He should have noted that the sack is a lot lighter than he would have expected, but they never do in opera. And what alerts him to what has happened is the Duke wakes up and starts singing La Donna Mobile, and Rigoletto can hear it. So we end the opera with Rigoletto cradling his dying daughter in his arms and realizing the extent of the father's curse. You can kind of see why Verdi was so attracted to this story. So that's just a few little musical ideas I wanted to share with you. But I want to say one thing that Verdi does, and not enough composers do this. This is the same at the end of Traviata. The very last words that Rigoletto says on a high F flat, that's a Verdi baritone note, are, la maledizione, tears his hair, it says in the, well, we'll see if he has any to tear. And then it finally concludes. This is an opera, once the story's been told, it brings it to a conclusion very quickly with the music. It doesn't go on and on and on. So thus concludes the sad story of Gilda and Rigoletto. Maddalena is played by a mezzo-soprano. So in that wonderful quartet we have what we would call still a Verdi baritone. We have Gilda, who is soprano, Maddalena mezzo-soprano, and the Duke tenor. Now, this was, as I said, a smashing success. We can't say the same for La Traviata on its first night, but it very quickly became one. So Verdi went on to become one of the great international superstars of opera. He was wealthy. He, very ornery, very prickly personality. Can I share a little anecdote with you? His scores are unbelievably filled with very precise instructions as to articulation, dynamics, all the things that he wants the orchestra and singer to do. Nothing is left up to chance. And somebody once asked if a certain, and people do throw in high notes. I don't think he would have approved of that. But someone once asked if a certain passage could be somewhat modified. And Verdi wrote back saying, I might not object to such a question if just once I had been able to hear one of my scores with every detail in the score observed. But I never have, not once. And the writing got thicker and thicker. Not ever, underlined, ever. Never, it's pen scratching through the paper now. Never, ever have I seen a score with all my details observed. So what that reminds me is that he wanted them observed. They are meaningful. So he went on to give ever and ever more reduced operas, in the sense that he was fanatically obsessed with getting the words right. All of his librettists would have said he was really tough to work with, but he was always right. And so very famously, his last collaborations were with someone who was already a composer, a young composer who in fact had ridiculed Verdi, because after all, when you live that long, you become an old fogey. And so for a while, he was considered yesterday's news. But Arrigo Boito was nobody's fool. He realized, okay, I was wrong. And the House of Ricordi wants me to work with this guy because everyone thinks he's retired. And they do together produce those two Shakespearean masterpieces. In fact, I like to think when he finally produced Otello, which is great, the greatest Italian tragic opera, everyone thought, oh, he's really outdone himself. Now he can enjoy a relaxing retirement on his farm. Nope, he gives them a comedy. He finishes with a comedy. And then he lives another few years. And when he died, his funeral was held in a church. And I believe I read that in his will he actually asked for no music. But they're Italians, of course they were singing. And they sang the Song of the Exiled Jews from Nabucco from 60 years earlier. And that brings the story to a close of this great, great operatic composer. And that first telltale international smash hit, Rigoletto, that you're all going to see. Thank you.